application or fulfillment of the present convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute." End of quote. South Africa and Israel are both parties to the Genocide Convention, and neither of them has entered a reservation to Article 9 or any other provision of the Convention. The Court then recalls that Article 9 of the Genocide Convention makes its jurisdiction conditional on the existence of a dispute relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the Convention. A dispute is a disagreement on a point of law or fact, a conflict of legal views or of interest between parties. In order for a dispute to exist, it must be shown that the claim of one party is positively opposed by the other. The two sides must hold clearly opposite views concerning the question of the performance or non-performance of certain international obligations. To determine whether a dispute exists in the present case, the Court cannot limit itself to noting that one of the parties maintains the Convention applies while the other denies it. Since South Africa has invoked as a basis for the Court's jurisdiction the compromissory clause of the Genocide Convention, the Court must also ascertain at the present stage of the proceedings whether it appears that the acts and omissions complained of by the applicant are capable of falling within the scope of that convention, ratio materiae. The Court recalls that for purposes of deciding whether a dispute existed between the parties at the time of the filing of the application, it takes into account in particular any statements or documents exchanged between the parties, as well as any exchanges made in multilateral settings. In so doing, it pays special attention to the author of the statement or document, its intended or actual addressee, and its content. The existence of a dispute is a matter for objective determination by the Court. It is a matter of substance, not a question of form or procedure. The Court notes that South Africa issued public statements
want the government to work. That is when you see the Freedom Caucus, that's what their situation.
In light of the nature, scope, and extent of Israel's military operations in Gaza, Israel's actions amounted to violations
people
of its
thought it was true, or people could grab onto it. Trump is not doing that this time. This is really defendant Trump versus candidate Trump. And defendant Trump has a totally different set of needs.
History, quote, "The court is accustomed to defendants who refuse to accept that they did anything wrong. But in my 37 years on the bench, I cannot recall a time when such meritless justifications of criminal activity have gone mainstream."
Meritless justifications of criminal activity.
The rioters interfered with a necessary step in the constitutional process, disrupted by the lawful transfer of power, and thus jeopardized the American constitutional order. This was not patriotism. It was the antithesis of patriotism. And though he did not mention Donald Trump by name, Lamberth specifically called out language used by Trump and his allies who have described January 6th defendants as hostages. Joyce, does this give us any indication, President, any impact on Donald Trump's cases on these issues?
So this was a real shocker coming from Judge Lamberth, Mika. Quite frankly, you don't see federal judges weigh in with this sort of language. I think, we say unprecedented all the time. This really is. The implication for Donald Trump, I think, is hard to say. Is there a sense in the judiciary that enough is enough? Perhaps we've reached that point where the judges have begun to realize that the traditional slow-rolling criminal justice process needs to be amped up if we're going to protect the Constitution the way it needs to be protected in 2024.
Yeah, this is certainly striking, for who says it. A federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, Katty K. And it is, though, at the same time, such evidence of the utter grip that Donald Trump has on the Republican Party, where the big lie is part of their bloodstream. And the judge did note a few elected officials, not by name, but by words of what they've said and how they've downplayed what happened on January 6th, calling those in prison, calling them hostages, suggesting that they were political prisoners. And as we have seen nearly on a daily basis, there's no sign of that wavering. So, this is a real challenge for the Biden team as they frame the stakes of selection. They're going to talk about democracy, but it seems like half the country's already made up their mind and picked against it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This judge is a judge appointed by Reagan and not by Donald Trump, right? I think we might have had a different set of words from somebody that Donald Trump had appointed. And we saw in Iowa, we saw in New Hampshire, the number of Republicans who voted in both the caucuses and the primaries who believe that Joe Biden did not win the 2020 election, that Donald Trump did, is staggeringly high. And I think that, that when the White House goes out, they're going to look at Donald Trump, Dobbs, and democracy as their kind of big selling points for this election. But if half the country's already decided that democracy is sort of something that they have prepared to bet against because they saw what happened on January the 6th, they saw what happened in the 2020 election, and they are fine with that, then that's going to be a tricky sell, because for all the polling suggests that for people who think that democracy is an important issue, they're already going to be voting for the Democratic Party, so it's, voting for Joe Biden. And the question is, how many of those independents can he win, and what are the issues that are going to tap into those independents? And I'm not sure that democracy is going to be an issue, according to the polling, that is going to get people away from that fence that they're still sitting on.
Joyce, in another legal matter for Donald Trump, he'll be back in the courtroom, we're told today, down in Lower Manhattan in this penalty phase of the E. Jean Carroll defamation trial. He took the stand yesterday, the former president did, only for about 3 minutes under strict rules from the judge about what he could and could not talk about. He managed to violate those rules twice in 3 minutes as he complained that all this was so unfair to him. What do you expect to see today? In our last hour, we talked maybe by the end of today, Lisa Rubin suggested that the jury might want to reach some kind of decision after closing arguments today about just how much Donald Trump owes E. Jean Carroll. What's your sense of things today?
Juries can be so unpredictable. The earlier jury in the first Carroll trial came back very quickly. No guarantees that that will happen again, because the difficult issue this jury has to resolve, there will be compensatory damages. There was testimony that talked about a range from roughly $7 to $12 million that it would cost to repair E. Jean Carroll's reputation. The more difficult issue is punitive damages, meant to punish Trump, meant to deter him from repeating his conduct. And I think we'll see some interesting arguments. Yesterday, Roberta Kaplan, E. Jean Carroll's lawyer, put into evidence tapes of Donald Trump's deposition in the New York Attorney General's fraud case, showed Trump boasting about the value of his brand and talking about his billions. And so Carroll's lawyers will tell the jury, you must return a damages award in an amount that's sufficient to get the attention of the self-proclaimed billionaire. It might take the jury a while to sort that one out.
Interesting. Former Trump aide Joyce, Peter Navarro was sentenced yesterday to 4 months in prison for contempt of Congress. In September, Navarro was convicted on 2 counts of refusing to testify and supply documents to the January 6th committee after invoking executive privilege, despite the fact that the committee sought information related to his work on the Trump campaign, not in the White House. At the sentencing yesterday, federal judge Amit Mehta admonished Navarro for his lack of remorse. So, Joyce, does he head right to jail, or does an appeal keep him out? And how does this impact other members of Trump's team and Trump himself in terms of this outcome?
So Judge Mehta didn't rule immediately on whether or not Navarro will get an appellate bond. You're only supposed to stay out during an appeal after you've been sentenced if your appeal raises significant non-frivolous issues. This one, I think, frankly, is a foregone conclusion. He's not entitled to immunity if for no other reason than because Joe Biden refused to extend executive branch immunity here. But Steve Bannon has been permitted to stay out on a bond while his case is on appeal. I think it's likely that Navarro gets the same treatment.
I'm curious your thoughts, Claire McCaskill, as both a senator and a prosecutor, about this sentencing.
Well, as a person, I wish it was 4 years instead of 4 months. But it is always heartening to see the system work and to see someone who has worn a suit and tie to work forever and has been in the halls of power be held accountable for refusing. But, I wish more people had been charged with contempt of Congress. I understand why they weren't, but Congress has to work on oversight. And as a side, Joe, as you guys were talking about what McConnell said yesterday and people started reporting that he was folding to Trump, let me give you another view of that. You know what I think McConnell was doing yesterday? He was making Trump own the fact that he was trying to stop the border control bill. He did that so everybody would understand that it is Donald Trump calling these senators like ridiculous Ron Johnson and the other Trump lackeys in the Republican caucus in the Senate and the entire House that is being called by Trump and told by Trump, don't fix the border, don't fix the border. That's, I think, what McConnell was doing. And of course, you immediately saw Tom Tillis and you saw Romney and you saw others stepping up and going, yes, that's exactly what's happening. Donald Trump is keeping the border open. So kudos to McConnell for having more of his strategery, because he's the one who now has got this in the wide open.
All right. And former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, thanks very much for being on this morning. So conservative columnist Mark Thiessen was on Fox News last night talking about why he thinks former President Trump might end up losing another election this November.
I'm not surprised that he's raising money. What I'm worried about is his ability to win over Haley voters once this thing is over. When he says anyone who makes a contribution to Bird Brain will be permanently banned from MAGA, does that apply to Haley voters too? It shows that he hasn't learned any lessons from why he lost in 2020. He lost in 2020 because he lost 43,000 swing voters in 3 states. And about 43,000 swing voters will decide this election next November. He's got to win them over. They're not MAGA. They are either Democrats or center-right Republicans who are not big fans of his. He's got to win them over and expand his base, not shrink his base. You don't ban people from MAGA if you want to become president of the United States again.
Well, and we've seen this before, Molly. We saw it in the Arizona governor's race where Kari Lake said McCain Republicans are not welcome in this party. That's exactly who you want in the party. We heard MTG and others, I think it was in New Hampshire, talking about how they were going to expunge people from the